A viewer wrote in with two big questions. Will grass-fed and finished beef be too chewy for my family, and is air-chilled chicken really the better buy? If you've ever wondered the same, well, you're not alone. In the next few minutes, I'll give you a simple plan for tender, grass-finished beef and a smarter way to choose chicken that goes beyond the label. A quick thanks to the viewer who sent these two questions, because chances are you've had them too. And if your first grass-finished steak ate a little lean and chewy, well, that's not a failure, it's just a method mismatch we can fix fast. And on chicken, air-chilled can be helpful, but it's not the whole story. I'll show you a cleaner third option that focuses on the processor and not just the label. So two quick promises as we dive in. You'll leave with a simple, repeatable steak plan for consistently tender, grass-finished beef. And you'll know exactly how to choose chicken with confidence. Let's start with beef. If you've been hesitating on grass-finished beef because you're worried it's going to be too chewy, or even if your first experience in consuming grass-finished beef was that it was chewy, there's a couple of things that we need to talk about that can completely change this experience for you. The first is that we need to acknowledge that if you're comparing grass-finished beef against conventional beef, you're comparing apples to oranges here. It's not apples to apples in this conversation, even though we are talking in both scenarios about beef. It really does end up being a different product because those last 3 to 6 months of how that animal is raised has a significant impact on what you perceive in the taste and quality of that meat. Animals that are grass finished, well, they're out finishing on their natural forage. Animals in those feedlots are being pushed a forage that is not their natural forage. They're consuming grains at a high percentage. They're consuming distiller's grains in many instances. And as a result of that, that is going to change the chemistry in these animals and ultimately lead to a weight gain for one thing, but it's going to change their metabolic state and not in an ideal direction either. As a byproduct of that, you do get changes in the meat. Because that has been the norm, many individuals will perceive that as the standard. But let's differentiate because you're interested in grass finished now, and the assumption inherently that it's going to be tougher, well, not necessarily. So here's what we need to consider first of all. Remember that grass-finished beef, it's leaner by design. That's part of the reason, that's one of the benefits of consuming grass-finished beef. And it does have a bolder, more robust flavor to it. You might call it a cleaner flavor. You might call it a more savory flavor. But it has what would often be termed as, from a culinary or dietary standpoint, the true notes, the true flavors of that food source is what you get with grass-finished beef that many individuals are not accustomed to, that you don't get with your conventional beef. It also has what we consider, you'll see different terms for this. You might see this as a iron-focused, iron-forward, iron-centric. These are all looking at the coloration in the meat, and again, the things that can influence that flavor. Iron certainly can be one of those. Your grass-finished meats oftentimes are going to have a darker, redder appearance to them, and that leads to that more natural flavor. That also has a tendency to, if you're thinking in regards to chewy, this can ultimately affect the texture as well. And some of the things that have to be considered when you're talking about texture are, for example, aging. How long was that animal aged after it was processed? Was it not aged at all? Was it aged up to a month? These are all variables that notably are not consistent across the board. So there's not one simple answer to this aging component. I'll explain more on that in a moment. The cut. You'll recognize that certain cuts are just going to be more chewy. Certain cuts are going to be more palatable for a lot of individuals. They're going to have a softer texture to them. And maybe most important in this whole list is the methodology of cooking that is employed. And I'm going to share one with you called the reverse sear. If you haven't if you haven't ever heard about this, this can be one to employ that can help with that taste right away, or help with that texture right away. But let's talk about the tender checklist, if you will. These are the things that you need to be thinking about when you're trying to ensure that you've got a tender animal. Let's go back to the aging. I want to start there. This is dependent on the animal itself. It's dependent on the breed. It's dependent on the size of the animal. It's dependent on the environment. There's a lot of factors that play into this aging process. I will share with you that when it comes to the animals that we produce here at Harvest Hills Ranch and that we harvest, I don't hang our animals, and meaning I don't age those animals. When those animals are put down on the day that happens, that they're harvested, they may sit for a day or two, but they're going on into processing. They're going on to the butcher to cut them. They're not going to be hanging because it's not ideal for the breed of cattle that I raise. Now, I have raised cattle. For example, at one point we were raising longhorns, and we found that aging our longhorns for at least a week, and generally better for 2 weeks, was ideal. And many times longhorns are a breed that often will be labeled as a tough breed. And so if you think about just inherently they're labeled as that, and also the fact that they typically tend to be a little bit of a leaner cut compared to some of the other breeds, you would certainly think that when you're grass finishing those that they're going to be chewy, and this wasn't the case at all. We actually would never hear that complaint. So it was a matter of at least starting with the aging process and making sure that it's dialed in. And that's just something that you can ask your producer what they do and how they do it and for whatever reason they do it for. But remember, the aging process is not the only variable here. Two that you have far more control over are going to be your cuts and your preparation, your methodology for preparation. So what about the cuts? Well, if you start with some of your familiar cuts like ribeyes, New York strips, top sirloin, your fillets, your steaks are going to be a bit more chewier than what you might compare against with, say, something that you slow cook or long cook, or even with a grind. If you're looking at for example, if you want to do a family night, right, and you need something in preparation, you don't have a lot of time to cook, and you do a chuck roast, maybe a pot roast, if you will, or you even cook a brisket or a sirloin tip roast. Like a roast is really the theme here. If you're cooking something of that nature, depending on the time frame that you're cooking that, you will be able to continue to increase the tenderness in that meat just by the time frame that you cook it. And when it comes to, say, like weeknights, you need something fast and easy, well, that's where grinds come in with your ground beef. And as I go down that, your ground beef can be the most tender. Your roast are certainly right on the heels of that, of being tender. And your steaks, while they can equally be tender as well, just note that those inherently are not going to be the tenderest cuts. And even within the steaks themselves, you're going to get variability also. The point here is that if you've had one suboptimal experience when it comes to consuming grass-finished beef, don't let that be the end-all be-all. Try other cuts, because you're very likely to find that you're going to have a preference for certain cuts over others, for certain cooking methodologies that are all going to come into play. And as far as the overall strategy here, it simply comes down to don't overcook it. And when you're making this transition, add things in like tallow and butter that can increase not just the palatability and the flavoring and the taste profile for you, but they can also add some juiciness and moisture to that cut that inherently is going to give you a different perception of what you're consuming. Now, I told you I would give you one idea of a preparation process that you could look at, and this is called a reverse sear, or some might call this a two-zone grill methodology. It goes by different names. But the point on this is that when you're looking to cook a cut of meat, whatever that cut of meat is, you want to start by cooking that meat at about 10 to 15 degrees below what would be considered normal. And again, think in regards to how do you want this? Do you want it rare? Do you want it medium rare? Do you want it medium, well done, medium well, like whatever status of finish on that meat that you want in terms of preparation, you need to be about 10 to 15 degrees below that. And so when you cook at that higher heat, or at that lower heat, what you're doing is you're maintaining some of the moisture in that meat, some of the palatability there. And then what you can do to finish that is just pull it out, have a pan on the stovetop and sear it. This is where the reverse sear ideology comes into play. And you want to heat that pan up really well, and maybe for just 30 to 60 seconds on both sides. This is real quick. That's where you're going to finish cooking that meat, but you haven't overcooked the middle of that meat based on whatever your preference is, and you've got a cut that is more palatable there. And you can let that rest for 5 to 10 minutes before you consume it, but what you'll find is that when you cut through that meat, you'll find that that meat is easier to cut through. I can even think of examples where we've recently had steaks here in our home, and I've taken just a straight edge knife, not a serrated knife, but just a straight edge knife, and just lightly cut through some of our steaks, and it just cuts through it very easily. And don't forget, when you're doing this, go ahead and throw, again, a little butter, a little tallow in there. That's only going to accentuate the process. Maybe throw a little salt in there. A little salt's going to heighten the palatability as well. And you're going to finish it. You'll get a more savory experience that you'll really enjoy, and you'll forget about that chewy component altogether. But the most common mistake by far when it comes to your grass finished beef is overcooking it. It does not cook the same way that conventional beef does. It will cook faster, and you have to be more attentive to that fact to make sure that you don't overcook it. Now, there are a few things that you can do here as a transition. I've got a couple of ideas for you on this. So you can start with ground. Ground is very palatable, not chewy at all. You're not going to feel like you're just sitting there chewing on it and grinding on it for an extended period of time. And use that to start with and transition over to some of your more marbled cuts. One other idea that you could do here is that if this is a real big hang up for you, is that you could mix, say in a 50-50 ratio, your conventional with your grass-fed, or grass-finished. And I really will emphasize that difference. And actually, let me just throw a card up here on the screen. If you're not familiar with that difference between grass-fed and grass-finished, you really should be looking for grass-finished here, just because of some of the concerns around the use of the term grass-fed. But if you're hung up on that conversion, that transition with the family, you could combine at a 50-50 ratio. But I have to be honest with you on this. I truly don't advocate for that at all, because you're diluting the value of the grass-finished beef. And it's truly, at the end of the day, as long as you don't overcook it, it's really not necessary. And then my last option for you here is that you can move to leaner cuts once the technique of cooking has become second nature for you. So grass-finished beef, grass-fed and finished beef, that's what you should be looking for here. Your aging days, it's not universal. Start with grind, transition out of grind into some of your roast, and then on into your steaks. And just remember, you're looking for transparency here. You want to know, what do the pastures look like? Tell me about these animals. Tell me about your raising standards. Like, did you move these animals across? You need to be able to have these conversations. So don't trade off transparency for what was one bad experience for you. You need to develop a relationship with your food, and you need to develop a relationship with the person producing your food. Beef wasn't our only conversation today, though. That wasn't the only question that came in. The viewer also asked about air-chilled chicken, and I want to compare air-chilled chicken versus the processing in small USDA facilities. I also want to commend the viewer for paying attention to the processing of the bird, because this is often overlooked. You hear terms like pasture-raised, and maybe you get to talking about the feed that these birds are given, and those can all be ideal. However, that can all be undone with the wrong processing. If you're not familiar with this processing step, this is truly the last step in getting the birds to you. And there's a couple of things that you want to consider here. There's 3 primary options that you have in this processing when it comes to decreasing the potential contamination, the potential bacterial exposure or bacterial load. So you can have what's called a water immersion. And water immersion is after the bird has been processed, birds are going to be chilled together. They're going to be put into a cold antimicrobial water. But this water, you're running a lot of birds through this water. So the way that this would work is that if it cleans one bird, but that bird had something on it, it cleanses that bird, then when you dunk the next bird into that same tank or water bath, then whatever bacteria the first bird had, you're exposing every bird after that potentially to the same bacteria. And in these scenarios, these large scale facilities where you have a very high throughput, they're just running a lot of birds through these facilities every day, the potential for exposure and the number of birds that could be exposed is pretty high. Now, they will argue against this that you don't run into this issue because you're using chlorinated water. However, when you're using chlorinated water, you have the risk of exposing to halogenated compounds or chlorinated compounds, and those aren't health-promoting compounds. So that's not the ideal scenario there, but that is something you see certainly in your big conventional scenarios, in your large volume processing facilities is where you're likely to see that. Now, that was the first one. The second one is that you can have air chilled. And on this one, the birds are going to pass through cold air tunnels. They're on shackle lines. So they're just literally hanging. They're moving through these cold air tunnels. And as a result of that, they typically, even if they use some type of dip with these birds or they spray these birds, it can be done either way. When I say spray them, they're going to spray them with some type of antimicrobial. So, for example, maybe something like a hydrogen peroxide, which we'll talk about here in a moment. But when they do that, when you're hanging, those birds don't have the same degree of water uptake. So you've all seen, if you've picked up a whole bird in a package and you squeeze that package just in the average grocery store, you'll notice that there's a lot of liquid in those packages. And it doesn't just have to be a whole bird. You can see this with chicken breast. You can see it with chicken thighs. It's because of them dunking them in those tanks. Well, when you don't dunk them in those tanks, you don't have that same water retention in the packaging. And so the air chilled significantly reduces that water uptake. And some will advocate for this because even in the preparation phase, when you're cooking that, you might get a better browning experience. So many would argue that, air chilled birds even cook better, right? But this is still, most of these scenarios are still going to be a large plant unless it's stated that it's not a large plant. So it's still a pretty good rate of throughput through these facilities. That's your second option. The third option here is that you can have a small USDA processor, and that's our preferred path. And these are going to be a much lower volume of flow through. So that means that the control processes are going to be much greater just because you're not trying to get such a huge number of birds through these facilities every day. Birds are sourced from pasture-raised systems the majority of the time on this. And one thing I'll share with you on these is that there are some differences in the microbial exposure, so I'll come to this in a moment, but just know there are some differences there. Whether those actually, at the end of the day, translate into greater risk of exposure, maybe not. But what I want to emphasize here is that in these small facilities, the ones that we've used and we've seen firsthand, they're using an organic compliant hydrogen peroxide. And you've inherently with these facilities, these smaller facilities, you got more traceability and visibility of protocols. But this is all about air chilled, right? And so what I want you to take away from this is seeing that there is a third option, because that's often not talked about. And then second is that air chill does not automatically mean the best. Remember why you're doing this. Many of you are familiar with hearing about salmonella, but the other bacteria that plays a big role as far as exposure or potentially you having exposure when you're eating chicken is Campylobacter. That's another pathogenic organism that you don't want exposure to. That's a problem organism. But if I start with, I told you I'd go back to the rearing environment, so where they're raised at. Animals that are raised on pasture, that directly influences their microbial composition. And compared to an animal that's not raised on pasture, they're going to have different microbial compositions. There are some So there is debate about whether or not, again, that does translate to greater exposure through the processing of through the processing of the bird. That's up for debate, but there is a difference. So that's worth noting. When it comes to air chilled, what are the benefits of air chilled? I want to be fair to the air chilled conversation, is that it can improve the surface dryness and the cooking performance. Again, it's not sitting there soaking in water. It doesn't have all that water retention, that nasty water retention, but it doesn't tell you the whole story. You don't know anything about the rest of the processing of that animal. You don't potentially know how it was raised. You don't know anything about how it was handled. There's just a lot of question marks that you're never going to be able to answer, because when you're seeing air chilled, you're looking at a label. You're not talking to someone to get that information and get that feedback. When it comes to small plants, the flow control, meaning how the birds are moving through there, you're going to inherently have reduced commingling. So my birds are my birds, and when my birds go through there, I'm getting back my birds. My birds are the only ones that are handled until they are done, and then they'll move on to the next producer's birds. And so it's very easy to delineate where my birds begin and end and where another producer's birds begin and end. Bird condition. This is a byproduct of the pasture management, cleaner birds entering the plant, right? We know what quality of birds we're bringing to the processor. And then remember, you have different antimicrobials. I mentioned the chlorinated compounds earlier, but hydrogen peroxide is really the one that we like to see. And there's a clear rationale for why hydrogen peroxide is the better option when it comes to poultry. And it's because it's a very strong oxidizer, meaning that it's going to have a very potent effect. Your body produces hydrogen peroxide, so there's another win-win. And this is used, it can be used as a spray, it can be used as a dip or a mist. A lot of times it's used as a spray. It's not generally going to be used as a dip. And it's one that, because it is very thorough as an oxidizer in killing off organisms that you don't want around, very similar to chlorine, it's efficient, but remember, it does it without producing all these halogenated byproducts that you don't want, that are harmful to human health. And there's also some other relative benefits, if you will, in that it has very broad antimicrobial action. So it can target salmonella, it can target campylobacter, and these other organisms that can be associated with the meat spoiling. It's going to get those as well. When you look at the simplicity of the structure of hydrogen peroxide, when it decomposes or breaks down, you're just left with water and oxygen. Again, elements or compounds that are very inherent in the body and very inherent in the human biochemistry, and that are certainly not causing us any concern. And then it's environmentally favorable as well, right? We don't want to go through all of this process and be doing things that are going to be detrimental to the very environments that we're trying to support, that we're raising these animals in. That's not the same conversation when it comes to chlorine. And don't forget, you have transparency when you're operating in these models where the producer is using these small USDA processors, because now you're directly able to interface with the producer and ask them questions. So my practical buying advice for you on this is that air chilled is good. I don't want to say that it's not, but just keep in mind, it's not the only way to sanitize. It is generally best when it's used in combination with something else like hydrogen peroxide. And chicken quality, well, it goes beyond the processor. Again, great job to the viewer for acknowledging that the processing process is important, but you can't just end there. You've got to have a better view of everything that's going on around you. Now, my cooking tip for you when it comes to chicken is very much like what it was with beef. Don't overcook it to the point that you dry it out. That is absolutely one of the biggest mistakes that individuals make, whether it's grass-finished beef, whether it's pasture-raised chicken. Do not overcook that bird. You're familiar with cooking a bird that's been soaking in water that it was cleaned in. You're not getting that any longer, so your probability that you're going to more likely dry that bird out because all that moisture is not there at the start. And let me say this, you can get a very tender, juicy, moist pasture-raised chicken. Our customers mention this all the time. They just love the flavor of our chicken. And it's because they're not overcooking it. They're cooking it with very close attention to how long whatever cooking method they're using or how long they're doing that. So my general buyer's checklist for you when it comes to chicken, well, you should be looking for pasture raised, certainly. You should be asking questions about feed, and you should know about the processing. What does that look like? Is it being processed in a small USDA facility? Are they using things like hydrogen peroxide that is even better, organic compliant? And when it comes to handling, how can I handle this bird, right? If it's in a vacuum sealed pack, this is the other thing I love about our packaging, is that our packaging is also very transparent. When you look at our packages of birds, it is very evident that there is not a ton of that nasty water retention in there. You're just getting the bird. You're getting the bird as it came directly from the processor, and it's still such a high quality product. There is not going to be all this purge. There's not going to be all those liquids that are going to remain. If Chewy was your roadblock, you've got a plan. And you don't need to chase labels to get clean chicken. Just choose the right farmer and their processor. Next up, I'll show you how your kids are silently inheriting the effects of your food choices that will last for generations.